Welcome to the Tech Talks by Microsoft EMEA. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. And today we are talking about Azure Stack HCI and how to deploy Azure Stack HCI, including a live demo. This is what we want to have a look at today, how to configure Azure Stack HCI, how to get started with Azure Stack HCI. And if you attended the Tech Talks from last week, you are already familiar with the Azure Stack HCI basics, because Azure Stack HCI is an hyperconverged infrastructure operating system. And Azure Stack HCI supports the scalability from 2 nodes to up to 16 nodes in a cluster. We want to deploy a 2-node cluster configuration today. So we want to deploy the minimum configuration for Azure Stack HCI. And for sure, we can expand this configuration with additional servers, with additional disk drives. We can configure the network based on our needs. Important is to understand that Azure Stack HCI is installed locally on our servers. So Azure Stack HCI runs locally on premises on your hardware. You need the Azure Stack HCI certified systems. We will use virtual machines for this demo. So it's possible to use virtual machines to have an easy and fast configuration, because if you reboot a physical server, you need some time for the power on self-test and so on. And in the virtual machine, it's much faster. And we will start with the installation of the Azure Stack HCI host operating system itself. So we will start with this live demo here about installing and configuring Azure Stack HCI. If you are wondering where to receive the Azure Stack HCI operating system, there's a website from Microsoft. You can reach this page via microsoft.com/HCI. And on this page, you will be able to find an Azure Stack HCI partner, and you can register for a free trial. The trial, these are the bits and bytes, and I mentioned this last week. To unlock the full functionality for Azure Stack HCI, we have to register Azure Stack HCI with Azure. And so these are the bits and bytes you can download here. I already downloaded the bits and bytes, and I prepared a virtual machine here. This machine here, the D102-AS HCI 83. And I want to start this virtual machine. So I'm starting machine in a production environment. You would use a physical host. So this is one of our Azure Stack HCI nodes we are using here. If you have any questions about the setup or the steps I'm showing to you, feel free to use the comments or the chat functionality on YouTube. If you put in there something, so your questions, your comments, I will see them here in my control software, control tool. And so I can take this question, I can take this comment and react to it directly. So let's select for me, the input method or layout German. I have a German keyboard layout here, so we'll use Germany. I will go to next, and I have the install option. And usually you are asked now for the product key and the edition. We don't have this for Azure Stack HCI, because Azure Stack HCI, there are no different editions. There are no different installation options. We only have to accept the license agreement. And we have to select custom. The upgrade installation doesn't make sense here. You will always have the upgrade. You select your planned system drive, and then with next, the installation starts. So this was it. We will have a look at this machine when the installation has finished. Let's have a look at 2 other machines I prepared. We will use the 71 and 72 later. And this is the result of the installation. When you have this machine installed, you have a server core installation. And we have the server configuration tool. If you ever installed server core, you should already be familiar with this. We have the sconfigs since Windows Server 2008 R2. the server core was introduced with Windows Server 2008. Then we didn't have the text-based configuration utility starting with Windows Server 2008 R2. We had the sconfig here, where we can change the domain workgroup membership, the computer name, the local administrator, the remote management options, and so on, by choosing one of these options 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the installation of Azure Stack HCI itself is very fast. So when we have a look at this node 83, then it's actually installing the features, then some updates finishing up, and then we have the restart, because this is an advantage of the server core installation. It has a reduced footprint, and this means that we have faster installation times, we have less patch management effort, and we have a reduced attack surface because we don't have all the features in this OS in there. We only have the core components. We don't have the graphical user overhead a traditional server with a full GUI installation has. So when this restart is finished, this machine is finished. This machine can be configured to join the domain, to install first roles, and so on. This is what we will have a look at here. So we will finish the first installation steps on this newly installed machine in a few seconds here after the reboot has finished here. So number 38. When we have, 83, when we have pre-configured the machine and the machine is reachable via the network, so the machine is already ready. I have only a visualization issue here. When I connect again, I can see I have the log on screen here. Again, a blank log on screen. This is a small bug we sometimes have here in the connectivity. Now it's there. So I want to change the password of this user. I will enter a new password. This is based on your password policy in your environment. And then after the first logon, we will see exactly this sconfig utility. Now we could already start with the Azure Stack HCI cluster configuration and deployment. What I prefer to do is to rename the computer and to join the computer to the domain. So I would always select 1 and 2, these two options, to ensure that the machine is already domain joined and that the computer is renamed. I can do this via option 1, domain workgroup. I can select an D for domain, and then I can specify the name of the domain. My domain name is mhdemolab.de. I have to authenticate there. I need a password. Now the system asks if I want to rename the computer. Yes, I want to rename. The new name is D102-ASHCI83. And I have to provide the password again, and I will need a restart. So it's text-based, but these are the typical steps for joining a machine to a domain. If you decide for an integrated system, you already have pre-installed the Azure Stack HCI OS, but for sure you also have to integrate the machine into your domain. One moment here, if we want to log in now with a domain user, we have to press escape 2 times, then we can select other user. We can specify administrator at mhdemolab.de and my password. Now this user logs on. And last step I would recommend to prepare here before you start with the deployment wizard is to change the time zone. Sorry. The time zone, because the default time zone is not correlated to your location. So I will choose number 9 for date and time zone, and then change the time zone to my region here to ensure that the time is shown correctly. So now everything is prepared. so I can switch to the Windows Admin Center, because the Windows Admin Center is the tool for deploying Azure Stack HCI clusters. What we see here is a Windows Admin Center installation. It's the latest version of Windows Admin Center, and I want to add something new. And here we can see we can add new clusters. This is what we will go for. We don't add existing, we want to create a new cluster. We want to create a new Azure Stack HCI cluster. Here we can see server clusters, but in the next step, we will see this also covers the Azure Stack HCI clusters. Let's select here for the Azure Stack HCI operating system, because these are the two choices you can see we have here, Windows Server based or Azure Stack HCI based. I will go for the Azure Stack HCI based version, and I will have all the servers in one location. An Azure Stack HCI exclusive benefit is to use the stretch cluster. So we have servers in two sites. But to start with a stretch cluster, we need minimum 2 servers in each site, so minimum 4 servers in the cluster. With the option I am choosing here, I need minimum 2 servers. So this is the minimum amount for this configuration. And we will decide for this one, minimum 2 servers. Okay. But we can have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 16 in one cluster. We will have a 2-server configuration. And we have a wizard, and this wizard is really great. It has the 5 main areas: get started, networking, clustering, storage, and SDN. And we have different sub-steps here in each of these main areas: the get started part, the networking part, the clustering, and so on. So let's get started checking the prerequisites. So I've prepared something on the servers already to save us some time. We want to add the D102 minus Azure Stack HCI 71. This is a server I've prepared for us for this demo. The Windows Admin Center is searching for the server, and I will add the server, and I will add the D102 minus Azure Stack HCI 72. I will add this machine here. And there might be an error or warning that says that there's a different configuration on these two servers. Because if the wizard already provides first data and it has not finished the system analysis, this might occur that we see a warning, a temporary warning or error. Then wait till the system is fully analyzed, and then we will see, okay, the systems are ready, everything is fine, we can continue. This is what you should see if you are working in a real life scenario with an Azure Stack HCI certified hardware. There shouldn't be anything wrong here in this step. The next step, join the domain, could be done by this deployment tool here. But as you know, for the domain join, we need a restart. And if I wouldn't have prepared the domain join, I would have to restart the servers here. And so I've prepared it. This saves us some time. I have also already installed the features. If you have not installed the features, then you can click here on Install Features, and this tool installs the features we see here in the list automatically on all the nodes. So it doesn't matter if you have 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 8 nodes. It installs the data deduplication. It's your decision if you use the deduplication, but it's installed. Hyper-V is installed, the BitLocker drive encryption, the data center bridging, the failover clustering, network ATC, Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell, and Hyper-V modules for Windows PowerShell. If you are running with virtual machines, then you maybe will see an error with the Hyper-V that nested virtualization is not enabled. And you will see this warning or error even if you have enabled the nested virtualization. So in this case, please install Hyper-V manually on the nodes, and then you can successfully complete this step here. I mentioned I'm using virtual machines for this demo. For a production environment, for sure, you will use physical hosts for the Azure Stack HCI installation. So let's go to next, install updates. So here, my systems are checked if there are updates available from Microsoft. So I have the chance to install these updates before proceeding with the configuration. Let's see the updates. Yeah, okay, I have 4 of them here on the first node. I have 4 of them on the second node. I have some .NET Framework updates here, 2 of them. I have a security update. Usually you will see this because the Defender is also updated via the update feature here. And we have an May cumulative update for Azure Stack HCI 21H2. So recommendation for a production environment is to install these updates here. I will save the time and go to next because I can install the updates also afterwards. Here in the install hardware updates, we can read that there are actually no hardware updates for my system. I think this is clear. I mentioned I'm working with virtual machines. If you have physical machines and you are running an integrated system, you will see here the updates for the hardware. So if there are firmware updates or driver updates, they will be provided here. If you have a validated node, it depends on the hardware vendor if you will see updates or not. But for the integrated systems, this is a required feature to have the updates here. So restart the servers. Everything is ready. Usually you have a restart that is required here. You have the domain join, you have installed updates and so on, then you will need a restart. I restarted these servers 20 minutes ago to have the machines prepared for the live demo now. So in the last step, I can choose how to configure the host networking. 2 options are available: network ATC or manual configuration. We will use, let's say this is option 1, this is option 2. We will use the option 2 to see what happens in the network configuration. It doesn't matter which wizard you are using. Usually the default installation option saves your time because it uses some default configuration settings, some recommended configuration settings. In the manually or advanced installation or configuration, you can specify your concrete individual needs. So I will decide for manually configure. What's the advantage of network ATC? Here we can see we have a single network configuration for all servers based on the best practices. And this is managed by network templates. It's called network intents. I think it's easier to understand when we talk about templates. The official naming is network intents. This means we configure, when we decide for network ATC, different network roles that are applied to our servers. So the advantage is if we add another server at a later time, we don't need the documentation where we can read, okay, there's a domain network, there's a management network, there are 2 SMB networks. We only apply these templates and then everything works. The requirement is that our servers are absolutely identical regarding the network configuration, but this is the recommendation for Storage Spaces Direct. It's a requirement to have an identical disk layout in the servers. It's strongly recommended to have also identical network configuration and so on. So usually you will have this identical configuration. And then you can work with this network intents and you can work with network ATC. But when we decide for network ATC, we will not see all the steps that are configured from the network. So let's go to manually configure host networking and let's go to networking. We see 5 areas. And the first step is that the network adapters are validated. It's actually validating the network adapters. It's checking if these network adapters are available, if everything is working here. So we have to wait for this check of the network adapters. Usually this is a fast step because it only checks which network adapters are available. The network adapters are listed, including the IP and MAC address information here to ensure that you can identify the different networks. So today, it's Monday the 23rd May, takes a little bit longer than expected, but here you can see it's live. It's not a video, it's not screenshots, it's really live at the system. And it's actually validating the network configuration. So what could be the issue or the cause for a longer validation? Maybe I have a misconfiguration in my network regarding the cabling. Maybe I have some cross links that were not planned, where the validation realizes that some ports are not reachable or not online. Maybe I have some disabled adapters. Maybe I have a misconfiguration where I have more or less adapters in one server. So we will see this in a few seconds or minutes when this has finished here. So it's a perfect time for you to use the chat. And now the validation has finished, but you can still use the chat to send in your questions. So let's have a look at the network configuration. So everything is fine here. It only took longer than expected. There were no issues. I have the adapters 1, 2, 3, 4. All the adapters are 10 gigabits in my configuration. I have the MAC addresses, the names, the status is up and running. If I don't want to use specific adapters for storage spaces direct in Azure Stack HCI, I can disable adapters here. I can include or exclude adapters. And if they are disabled adapters, I can enable them. For me, everything is fine. The minimum amount is to have 2 adapters. I usually prefer to have dedicated storage adapters. I will explain this in a few seconds, what this means. So this is the reason why I have 4 ports here. This means usually 2 dual port adapters. It could also be 4 one-port adapters or 1 4-port adapter. There are many discussions about redundancy. Should this be dedicated network interface cards, or is it fine to have all the ports on one adapter? For sure, then this is the single point of failure. Let's go to next. Now the question is about the management network. Which network should be used for managing the host? 2 choices are available. I can select 2 physical network adapters teamed for management or 1 physical adapter. When I select for 1 physical adapter, I can read, okay, 1 management adapter. So I have 1 physical NIC that is used for host management. I should select exactly 1 adapter in the list below. If I decide for teamed management adapters, I will see, okay, it builds a switch embedded team for these adapters for host management, and I need to select exactly 2 adapters. So for the host management, via the Windows Admin Center deployment, it's not possible to have a team with 4 or 6 adapters for the management of the host OS. From the technical perspective, this is possible because Switch Embedded Teaming supports up to 8 identical adapters or up to 8 identical ports. We want to use the 1 physical adapter for management option here. Okay, so I'll select the first one in the list, network adapter. So Two of the adapters are available, two are grayed out. The grayed out adapters, these here, I will mark them. These adapters are in a different network, so they are not reachable from the domain network. And I will use these adapters for the SMB traffic in the next step. Okay, I've selected the adapters and I click on Apply and Test. And this is what I like absolutely about this configuration wizard in Windows Admin Center. It's not only apply and then I have to test it manually. It's always apply and then please test. The changes are successfully applied. Everything works fine. Now let's come to the virtual switch. Here for the virtual switch, we have three different options. The first option teams all the all the four adapters to one set switch. So we have only three adapters remaining. This is why I started with three adapters in my my spoken information. Important is to understand this set switch in the middle of the picture, this switch embedded teaming switch, this one here. This is set, and from the technical perspective, set switch, and this can have minimum 2, maximum 8 ports. So it depends on your configuration if you can use 2, 3, 4, or 8 ports. I don't have 8 ports in my configuration here. So the maximum in my configuration is to put 2 ports to this switch embedded teaming configuration, because the third port I have available actually, port number 4 here, this is for another use planned here, because here you can see I have a different IP address here. So this port is intended to be used from the virtual machines for the virtual machine switch. I want to have dedicated. When you put all the NIC ports to one set switch, the question is how to separate traffic. And this is done by the logical layer. So there will be created virtual network interface adapters where you can specify the bandwidth for virtual machine traffic, for storage traffic, and so on. So the first one is, let's say, the typical configuration Microsoft recommends. My preferred configuration is the second one. And this is a preferred configuration by myself because I am seeing many configurations in the field where the customers and the partners are struggling because of this aggregation of the bandwidth and the separation on the logical layer. So the advantage of the second option is that we have one configuration for the virtual machine traffic. And here we have 2 physical NIC ports. We can have up to 8 of them. We bring these ports to a switch embedded teaming switch and provide the aggregated bandwidth for our virtual machine traffic. And then we have dedicated physical ports, minimum 2 of them, for the storage traffic. And if you are thinking at a traditional storage, when we started with our presentation, we had this comparison of the traditional stack and the hyperconverged infrastructure stack. And in the traditional stack, you always had the situation that you had some cabling from the servers to the storage fabrics, and from the storage fabrics to the SAN systems. And this from each server. This is the first server, and we have the second server, and so on. And this means if we had this configuration, the cord we used, the connection here, the blue one, the red one, decided for the bandwidth and the availability of this connection. And my experience from the field is that for many customers, it's easier to have a dedicated cable for the storage traffic. And this is exactly what we will built when we have dedicated NIC ports for SMB traffic. Another advantage of the second option is that we can have up to 8 ports for the virtual machine traffic, and we can have up to 32 ports for the storage traffic, because here we are using SMB multi-channeling. So we don't build a team. This here is SMB multi-channeling. SMB multi-channeling, and this here is a set switch. The set switch has the requirement of 8, maximum 8, minimum 2 identical ports. SMB multi-channeling does not have this limitation. And if we are looking to the first option here, this one here, compared to the second option we are actually talking about, then we have the situation that in the second option we can have more bandwidth. In the third option, we have the situation that we are building set switches for virtual machine traffic and another set switch for the storage traffic. The advantage here is the flexibility. The disadvantage is the additional management layer we have for the storage set switch that is not required from the technical perspective. So I will configure the option number 2. This is the best choice, in my opinion, if you have a customer that is very experienced with the traditional stack and is maybe new to the Azure Stack HCI. I will here skip the virtual switch creation to save some time, because we can create the virtual switch later. It's available in the Windows Admin Center. Then we can create a virtual switch, including the set teaming. Okay, let's go to next, RDMA. In a physical deployment, RDMA is very, very important, because remote direct memory access, it's recommended, as you can read here, provides an offloading to the network interface card. If you offload the traffic to the network interface card, you have reduced CPU load, so you have more resources for your machine workload, for your storage workload. And so this is the absolute recommendation. In my virtualized environment, I don't have RDMA here, so I will not configure RDMA here. The last step is to define the networks. Okay, let's start with the first one. This network is for SMB traffic. This is my SMB1 network. This is my first storage network, SMB01. And I will use the IP address 10.1.1.1. This is the first node. And the SMB02. This is the 1.1.2 here. Here in the third interface, this is my VM network, my VM traffic. Then I have the second host. I will use the SMB01 here. And I have the 10.1.1.2.1. So the last octet is here always my interface ID. The second one is my host ID here in this scenario. I have the SMB02, and I have the IP address 10.1. Yeah, some typing here. The 10. No. Okay. The 10.1.2.2, and I have the VM network here. So important is to know if we are using RDMA based on RoCE, RDMA over Converged Ethernet. The VLAN ID is required. So it's required to have the VLAN ID configured here. I'm not using RDMA, I'm not using Rocky here, so I don't need the VLAN ID. If you are using iWarp, the VLAN ID, the virtual LAN ID is optional. Okay, so let's select the advanced options. Here we can configure the jumbo sizes and the encapsulation overhead. So important when you are working on the jumbo frame size, ensure that your switch is really capable of transporting these larger packages. Okay, so let's apply and test this here. This takes a while, this needs some minutes because the interfaces are renamed, the IP addresses are configured, and the connectivity is tested. This is again the important step here. The connectivity is tested, so I can be sure everything is working when this has finished successfully here. So the changes are applied. We have seen this at the VM network. Actually, it's still testing connectivity. And usually, if I don't have a typo here, this should end successful in the configuration. The usual issues you see here are misconfigurations in the virtual LAN identifier, in the VLAN ID. We often have the situation that there are typos in the IP addresses. Here I can see, okay, network connectivity test. Okay, when you are ready, select next. I'm absolutely ready for the next step. I'm happy everything was successful. So the next step is clustering. The basic configuration for an Azure Stack HCI cluster is a cluster. It's based on the technologies we have in Windows Server. So there's nothing specific for the cluster core components in Azure Stack HCI. It's the technology we know from Windows Server 2022, 2019, 2016. And there we know a cluster is supported and the cluster is validated successfully. So I will start with a cluster validation here. So we don't need um, specific hardware. We need the Azure Stack HCI certified hardware, yes. But if we have the Azure Stack HCI certified hardware and the cluster validation tests are successfully, then I have a supported cluster configuration here in my environment. So actually I'm at 78%, but this is not a linear progress bar. We have seen this single different steps when it started, then it jumped to over 70% when it was analyzing, and now it's gathering data about the nodes. And now the progress bar slowed down a little bit because here the validation needs to read many information on the nodes, and this will take longer if we have more nodes here. So in this information, we have very, very detailed information about the node configuration. So we have the OEM name, we have the firmware version, we have the driver versions, we have the configuration, and so on. It's important to review the report to see if everything is fine here, if everything is suitable. So when I have a look at the report, I can see everything is green here. So the inventory, the network, and the system configuration. If you have some warnings, you should jump to the specific area. So for example, in clicking on system configuration, and then you will see where is a misconfiguration. Often you have warnings in the validate software update level, because very often you have the situation that one node has installed some update that was not installed on the node 2 because you didn't use the central update feature I have shown you in the wizard. So if you are running the updates in the first part, in the getting started part, then usually you will have the same software update level here. Okay, with my cluster, everything is fine. So I can go to next and create the cluster. So in my list, I will open another tab here. to verify this with you together, I have already several clusters. When I go to my Windows Admin Center, I've already the cluster 40, 50, 60. We will install the cluster 70. So our cluster name is D102 minus Azure Stack HCI 70. This is the cluster 70, but Azure Stack HCI CL for cluster. I will use a dynamic IP address. In a production environment, you would specify a static address, but it will save the time and use a dynamic address. And in advanced, we can decide if maybe not all networks should be used for the cluster configuration for the cluster environment. So let's create the cluster. Hang on, this is going to take a while. So the cluster is configured, the cluster is formed. We can already see the next step is the storage configuration. So till this step here, configuring the cluster, these are the same steps we have, or very similar steps, not the same, very similar steps we have to configure a traditional Windows Server cluster. But now when this was successful, we can create or specify the storage part, and there it comes to Storage Spaces Direct. What is the technology behind Azure Stack HCI for the hyperconverged infrastructure part? Before we do so, we should read this here. Make sure to create a cluster witness once you're finished with this wizard. In a cluster, you need a witness to ensure that in the situation of a failure, there are always correct decisions based on the majority of the cluster votes. And important is to understand that each cluster node has a vote in the default configuration, and the witness also can have a vote. And if something fails, for example, a node fails, then it's important to have the majority of the votes available. And actually, we are configuring a two-node cluster. If one node fails and we only have one node vote remaining in the remaining node, this is not the majority because this is 50%. And if we have a witness, the witness also has a vote in a two-node configuration. In a three-node configuration, we also need a witness, but in the default configuration, the witness has no vote. In a four-node configuration, the witness has a vote, and so on. So here, the information, the witness is not configured by the wizard. This is an additional step. We will do this in a few minutes. So let's go next to storage. First step is to erase the drives. Usually you will have brand new drives in your server, so then there shouldn't be anything on the drives. But with clicking on erase drives, you can be absolutely sure that your drives are empty, that any metadata that has been on the drives has been deleted. And now we are ready to go to the next step, to check the drives. And here we can see I have 4 drives in each server. If you attended the session from last week, you know this is the minimum configuration when we are working in a flash-only configuration. If you want to review the session from last week, you can do this via YouTube. On YouTube, on the channel youtube.com/Sven Langenfeld, and on the YouTube channel youtube.com/Manfred Helber, you have the option to also watch the previous Tech Talk videos and live streams. And last week we talked about the concepts behind Azure Stack HCI, and then we talked also about the disk layouts here. So let's go to next. We have the storage validation. I mentioned a few minutes ago at the beginning of this live stream that for Storage Spaces Direct, we need an identical disk layout for each server. So we need the identical amount of drives and type of drives. And we have some specific requirements regarding the disk drives. You usually don't have to care about the specifications when you act based on my recommendation to only use validated nodes or integrated systems. Both is possible, both is validated by a default validation process provided or validation tool provided by Microsoft, but they should be minimum validated nodes. Here we can see everything is fine. Disk drives, file shares, and so on. The storage layers, so the storage tiers, the virtual disks, and so on, everything is successful. And here I have again a detailed report I can download and I can have a look on, and I can save this detailed report for later usage and for documentation here. So with the next step, I'm ready to configure storage spaces direct, and it's an easy button to click on Enable. With this, click on Enable. The Storage Spaces Direct part in Azure Stack HCI is configured and activated. And in a few seconds, we will be ready to access this new cluster. It's starting the health providers here. It's preparing the pool and the storage tier templates. And then in the last step, we can optionally configure the software-defined networking, but we will skip this here. Many customers think they have to configure software-defined networking, but it depends on your usage scenario for Azure Stack HCI if you need the software-defined networking. For default cluster configurations, even if you are running the hybrid tools and hybrid connectivity parts, you don't need the software-defined networking. Here, the recommendation is to download the final report where we can see the configuration of the cluster. I have the warning that there are no drives for cache, but cache is optional in a full flash configuration. And now I can go to the next step, SDN, and I will choose the option skip. Here at the bottom, I have the skip because I will not configure the SDN at this point of time. Let's go to skip. Here I can read, that's it. We are all done here. Go to connection list, but it might take a few minutes for the cluster to become reachable by name. So don't wonder if you go to Windows Admin Center immediately and you click on the cluster name and the first connect fails. If you have been too fast, maybe it's not listed in the system list, maybe you are not able to connect here. Just wait a few minutes and then it will work. If you have recurring connectivity issues, you should check if your DNS configuration is fine here. Okay, let's see the configuration of the cluster. The dashboard, there are no alerts. We have in the Windows Admin Center the virtual machines, the servers, and so on. What we can see here, this cluster is actually not yet registered in Azure. Let's see if we have enough time to register the cluster in Azure. If not, we will do this in the next session or in one of the next sessions. The first thing is what we should do is to specify in the settings for the cluster a witness. We have seen this in the information at the cluster configuration. We can specify a cloud witness. If we use a cloud witness, we need an Azure storage account. We can enter the storage account name and the storage key. If we want to use a file share witness, we need the path. I could use, for example, the D102 minus, now let's check for a server we can use. We could, for example, use this machine here. And there we want to log on and prepare a file share. And this machine here, I have my shares and I have the witness for different servers, and I will go for shares and witness. So this is the D102 minus DC01. And I have the witness share. So let's select this one here in the wizard. It's the D01, DC01, DC01 / my credentials. If I didn't configure the nodes to have access rights to the share. So I can save this here. Witness settings are saved. The witness resource status is online. So the witness is up and running. So now this is fine and everything is configured here. When we go back to the dashboard and we want to have this Azure connection registration, then we can go to register this cluster. And I want to select my Azure sponsorship. This is my subscription I want to use. I want to use a resource group. It's here a resource group I'm using for testing, a test 01. I have West Europe for the resource group. In advanced, I can see this machine will also be enabled for Azure Arc. And now let's register this cluster. The registering is running in Azure. When the cluster is registered, the full functionality of this cluster is unlocked, and we have 60 days free of charge. After the first 60 days, we are charged based on the number of physical cores of our physical hosts. We have already discussed this in our previous session last week. Actually, it's still registering. As long as the cluster is not registered in Azure, we are able to create volumes. We are able to create virtual switches. We skip this in the deployment wizard. We can configure the drives, the volumes, and so on. It's not possible to create new virtual machines. So we cannot put any new workload on this cluster, but we can prepare everything till the cluster is connected. If the cluster is disconnected for a moment, we don't have any impact on our workload, because when we go to the settings of the cluster, the Azure Stack HCI registration, then actually the registration progress is running, but we can switch to another cluster that is already registered in Azure. Let's go to another cluster here. We'll open the Windows Admin Center again in a new tab. And here we'll select the cluster that is registered, for example, the cluster 20. Then we can see that we always have 30 days where we can use the Azure benefits without the need that the cluster connects to Azure again. Let's go to the Azure registration, and here I have the information. Last connect for me was at 9 a.m. today, and actually we have 12:53 p.m. and the registration still works. And this registration works for 30 days. So I need to reconnect this latest in 30 days. For sure, if my connectivity is there, my Azure Stack HCI cluster will connect earlier again to ensure that all the Azure Stack HCI functionality is unlocked. So we don't have any issues if we are disconnected for a few hours or a few days. We should never be disconnected for more than 30 days within a month. So we need this connectivity minimum every 30 days. For sure, it's better if we have a connectivity on a daily basis, but you don't have to be afraid if you have an internet connection that has some outages during the days or during weeks where your Azure Stack HCI cluster is running. Okay, this was the live demo about deployment of Azure Stack HCI. Next week, we will see how to manage Azure Stack HCI in Windows Admin Center. Again, many live demos next week, today in a week, Monday, 12 p.m. Central Eastern Time. We will see how to create volumes, how to create virtual machines, how to bring workload on this Azure Stack HCI cluster, and we will use exactly the cluster we deployed together today. So I'm looking forward to have you there in our Tech Talk next week, Monday. And tomorrow we have a Tech Talk support hour. In the Tech Talk support hour at 1 p.m. Central Eastern Time, we have time for your questions. So you didn't have any questions today in the comments, but if you have questions, feel free to come to this free support hour. Join via YouTube and ask your questions about Microsoft technologies. I'm looking forward to have you there. So thank you from my side for your time for the Tech Talks today about deployment of Azure Stack HCI, and looking forward to have you tomorrow in the Tech Talk support hour and to have you next week, Monday, in the next Tech Talk about configuring Azure Stack HCI workloads. There are many interesting options there, including also the automated update via cluster aware updating. Thanks for your time. See you. Bye.